In July 1964, Malcolm X made his fourth visit to Africa. This time round, he went to 7 African countries before coming to Kenya. He met with Kenyan leaders at the time, President Jomo Kenyatta and Oginga Odinga. In addition to this, he got the opportunity to address the Kenyan Parliament on 25th October. This was exactly 1 year after Kenya gained independence. The highlight of his visit, however, was his meeting with Pio Gama Pinto, a Kenyan politician who at the time was agitating for African socialism. This meeting has long been fodder for conspiracy theories. Some people argue that the ideas shared during this meeting is likely the reason why both Malcolm X and Pinto were assassinated just 4 months later. You see, Pinto was very outspoken, especially when it came matters pertaining to the distribution of wealth in post-independence Kenya. Before independence, Kenyans fought to liberate themselves from the British colonial government, which had seized land from the people and allocated it to British settlers. So one of the things Kenyans wanted was to get their land back. The idea was, after independence, they would find a way to equally distribute this land. However, as soon as the reins of power were handed over to the Kenyan elite, they distributed the resources among themselves, forgetting everyone else. Thousands of acres were allocated to just a few individuals. It is for this reason that J.M. Kariuki, a member of parliament and assistant minister at the time, came up with the phrase that Kenya is a nation of 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars. A year later, in 1975, he was also assassinated. Before independence, Pinto was on the same side ideologically with the Mau Mau and other leaders clamoring for Kenya's independence. But when greed took over, he spoke against it, and this could have been the reason why he ended up making enemies among Kenyan elites. The deputy speaker at the time, Dr. Fitz D'Souza, reportedly witnessed Pinto engaging in a shouting match with President Jomo Kenyatta in the corridors of parliament. This was February 1964, exactly a year before the assassination. Apparently, Pinto yelled saying, "I'll fix you." Not sure what he meant by this, but Oginga Odinga personally drove Pinto to the coast for safety. Joseph Murumbi, who was the Minister for Foreign Affairs at the time, passed by and assured Pinto that he would intervene on his behalf. So Pinto returned to Nairobi. Pinto's ideology was African socialism, which is more like Ujamaa, which President Julius Nyerere introduced and promoted in Tanzania. Remember, this is the 1960s and we are at the height of the Cold War. The Western powers were trying to keep their former colonies on their side. As much as socialism is not the same as communism, it was seen as a bridge because both communism and socialism were associated with the Eastern Bloc. The Western Bloc, on the other hand, promoted capitalism, which champions private ownership in economic activity. One other ideology within capitalism is democracy. Ever wondered why so many African countries were under dictatorships in the 70s and 80s? At this point in time, the US was unable to play the big brother role like it always does. Any move to force democracy on these African states would mean that they would switch over to communism. They held this privilege until the early 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed. Here in Kenya, multi-party rule was passed into law in 1991, the same year the Soviet Union collapsed. Prior to that, there was only one party, KANU. So for Pinto to promote socialism, he was not only working against the wishes of the former colonial government, but also the current Kenyan elites who had some sort of arrangement with the colonizers. Pinto was not alone in this fight for equality. Oginga Odinga was a confidant and a close ally. He wrote a book titled Not Yet Uhuru in 1969. Direct translation is Not Yet Independence. Before we continue with the details about Malcolm X's visit to Kenya and the impact it had on his ideologies, let me explain Pinto's and Oginga's motivations to speak up. So there was information that the British government had given £12 million to Kenya to rehabilitate freedom fighters, but the money had not been disbursed. Also, Secessional Paper number 10 on African socialism was to be presented in Parliament on the 29th April 1964. Both Pinto and Oginga felt that this did not truly reflect African socialism. So a secret meeting was held together with other associates to prepare their own blueprint and launch it on the same day. These ideological rifts could have led to Oginga's resigning from his government position, leaving Kanu 2 years later in 1966. Today, scholars argue that Secessional Paper Number 10 of 1965 widened the economic divide, thereby increasing poverty levels in Kenya. Malcolm X's meeting with Pinto centered around unification and solidarity among the melanated people of the world. At this point, Malcolm also learned about the Mau Mau and their tactics in radical activism, which were instrumental in the liberation of Kenya from colonial rule. Once he returned to the US, Malcolm began encouraging Black people and Black movements to borrow a leaf from Africa's independence movements, including Mau Mau. If these were the tactics that led to independence across Africa, then why not use them in the US to clamor for the rights of African American people? In a sense, by making these remarks, Malcolm X was seen as promoting violence among people. Therefore, this placed him in a precarious position with the US government. In addition, when JFK, the 35th President of the United States, was assassinated, it is reported that Malcolm X said, "Chickens had come home to roost," implying that the past actions of JFK were responsible for his demise. Malcolm felt that the foreign policies JFK pushed for were only meant to make the US appear as a responsible foreign power in Africa and other parts of the world. But back home, things were in shambles. He felt that he was not doing enough to reduce inequality within the country. Prior to Malcolm's visit to a number of African countries, he was part of a political and religious movement known as the Nation of Islam, which encouraged its members to create an independent Black republic within the United States. Before we talk about Malcolm's experience with Nation of Islam and the fallout that later ensued, we need to briefly discuss about the Bandung Conference of 1955. This was a gathering of 25 African and Asian states representatives in Bandung, Indonesia. Present at the conference were radical delegates like the Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser and Indonesian President Sukarno, who were for the idea that a united front against colonialism and economic domination was what Africa and Asia needed. At this point, Malcolm X got a light bulb moment and realized that this could be a great blueprint for anti-racist struggles in the United States. So when he went back to Harlem, he began using his status as minister of the Nation of Islam to educate his followers on anti-imperialist campaigns in Africa. Implementing this, however, had limitations. The authoritarian structure of the Nation of Islam prevented Malcolm from developing these connections. When he made his first trip to Africa in 1959, he had to decline an invitation to meet Nasser and to complete the Hajj in Mecca because it would be seen as disrespectful to do so before the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, did so. And as Malcolm became a prominent figure in the early 1960s, his close relationship with Elijah Muhammad developed into a bitter personal rivalry. So when Malcolm made the remarks about the chickens coming home to roost, Muhammad looked at this as a chance to ban him from giving public lectures for 90 days. Nation of Islam had already passed their condolences to the fallen president's family, so there was no way they would allow a member of the organization to tarnish this. Isolated from his community, Malcolm turned his attention back to liberation movements in Africa and Asia. Another reason I think brought Malcolm X at loggerheads with the Nation of Islam was the fact that during his first trips to Africa and the Middle East, Malcolm met with Sunni Muslims, and as they exchanged ideas, he realized that the teachings of the Nation of Islam differed greatly with mainstream Islam. His letters to his Muslim friends suggest that he had started having a lot of doubt about the theology of Nation of Islam. So the Nation of Islam believed in inherent superiority of Black people and claimed that its founder, Wallace Fard Muhammad, was an incarnation of Allah. This was particularly offensive to Muslim communities across the world. After getting banned from public lectures, Malcolm took this opportunity to complete the Hajj. He borrowed money from his sister, Ella Collins, and flew to Egypt. He then proceeded to Saudi Arabia in April 1964. It is said that Malcolm's perspective on a number of things shifted during the Hajj. He abandoned his hardline beliefs and his perspectives on race changed. This is what he says in one of his letters from Mecca. I have never before seen sincere and true brotherhood practiced by all colors together, irrespective of their color. You may be shocked by these words coming from me, but on this pilgrimage, what I have seen and experienced has forced me to rearrange much of my thought patterns previously held, and to toss aside some of my previous conclusions. After this, Malcolm X made additional trips across Africa and the Middle East, searching for new models of radical political action. This also gave him an opportunity to speak directly to new audiences across the world. When he returned to the US, he had decided to experiment with ideas for a new political structure that could adopt the tactics of African anti-colonial organizations. In June 1964, he founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the OAAU, whose name was inspired by the Organization of African Unity, the OAU. The OAAU charter stated that the organization would aim to combat police brutality, build resilient Black communities, and carry out cultural revolution to bring back Black Americans closer to their African ancestors. OAAU's first mission was to raise Black Americans' issues in international forum. Some sources state that Malcolm's collaboration with Pio Gama Pinto also centered around addressing the oppression of Africans and African Americans by charging the United States and the United Nations over crimes against humanity. In July 1964, 3 months before Malcolm and Pinto met, Malcolm arrived in Cairo intending to address the African Summit Conference of the OAU. In the script of his speech, he urged African leaders to commit themselves to the struggle of their long-lost brothers and sisters. He also asked for their support in urging the United Nations to condemn racism in the US. He went on to state that, since 22 million Black Americans were originally Africans, we strongly believe that African problems are our problems and our problems are African problems. A number of scholars and political analysts have over the years thoroughly analyzed the situation Malcolm found himself after the contents of this speech reached its audience. The sentiments were always the same. Malcolm X failed to anticipate how his radical language would be received by mainstream nationalist leaders. I'm not sure whether he was aware that most of these African countries were reliant on economic ties with the US and Europe, because in his speech, Malcolm X mentions American dollarism and threats of maximum retaliation against racism. This proved unpopular with leaders who had close economic ties with the US and Europe. In the end, Malcolm X was only allowed to attend the conference as an observer and was instructed to circulate his speech in written format rather than deliver it directly. In public, Malcolm X claimed that the intervention had been a success, but in private, he doubted it. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "The science of diplomacy and political maneuvering at the international level is much different and much more delicately difficult than getting on the soapbox here in Harlem. I have gotten an invaluable education by coming to this summit." It is also said that Malcolm X's inexperience with African and Middle Eastern politics also plunged him in complicated struggles. In August 1964, the Egyptian government presented 20 scholarships to Malcolm X. This allowed 20 of his followers to attend the prestigious Al-Azhar University in Cairo. This is a well-known tactic that the Nasser government had previously used to win favor among anti-colonial groups in Africa. Malcolm X, however, interpreted this move differently. To him, this was a political coup against the Nation of Islam. In a letter to his wife, he writes, "The fact that Elijah Muhammad was only able to send one student here in 34 years, and we are able to send 20 at one time, is the best yardstick by which to measure this wonderful blessing." This gift also attracted the attention of Saudi Arabia, and they were concerned that the Nasser government might be using Malcolm X to bring American Muslims into its own sphere of influence. At that time, Egypt and Saudi Arabia were in the middle of the Arab Cold War, and there was a lot of distrust between the two nations. So in response, Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia, who had earlier hosted Malcolm X in Mecca, prepared their own gift: 15 scholarships at the Islamic University in Medina. Egypt's Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs then went ahead to award Malcolm X the title of Dai, meaning missionary. This was to recognize his efforts in spreading Islam in the US. As anticipated, the Saudi government ensured that he was accredited by its own Muslim World League. Unaware about the intricacies concerning this rivalry, Malcolm X believed that he could bring both sides together. So this sucked him into a dangerous whirlwind of political rivalry. 1964 was a busy year for Malcolm X. He spent almost half the year touring different African countries. After he converted to Sunni Islam in April of that year, he had been receiving death threats that he suspected originated from Nation of Islam. For his own safety, friends and family urged him to stay in Africa. By the end of the year, he had been offered asylum in Ghana, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia. He would have chosen to remain in Africa, but he felt that too much time abroad would alienate him from the struggle in the US and any chance of creating meaningful political change. In his diary, he wrote that moving his family out of Africa permanently would be good for me personally, but bad for me politically. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "I realize many there in the States may think I'm shrinking my duties as a leader by being over here while there's such trouble there." In November 1964, although with some resistance, Malcolm left Africa, never to return again. On the 21st of February 1965, while giving a speech at Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan, Malcolm X was shot in front of his pregnant wife and 4 daughters who took cover on the front row. 2 days earlier, in an interview with Gordon Parks, Malcolm X had expressed his concern that the Nation of Islam was actively trying to kill him. After his death, investigations led to the arrest of 3 members of Nation of Islam, Mujahid Halim, Muhammad Aziz, and Khalil Islam. They were charged with first-degree murder. The following year, during the trial, Islam and Aziz maintained their innocence, but Halim confessed to the crime and even went ahead to testify that Islam and Aziz were innocent. Despite this, the 3 men were found guilty and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Looking back, I think Malcolm X recognized the danger his line of work put him. This was not new to him because he believed his father had suffered a similar fate. His parents, Louise and Al Little, were part of a movement founded by Marcus Garvey in 1916. It was known as the United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and its mission was to unite all people of African ancestry around the world into one great country, and at the same time calling for displaced Africans and their descendants around the world to return to the homeland continent. In doing so, they would liberate Africa from its European colonizers. During this time, the Littles lived in Omaha, Nebraska, but they had to leave in 1928 because they had been threatened by the Ku Klux Klan. Throughout the 1920s, Al Little was Garvey's representative in the Midwest. He was also a preacher. On most days, he would take Malcolm with him to union meetings. Listening to this conversation gave Malcolm a strong sense of black pride. Unfortunately, in 1931, Al was killed by a Lansing streetcar, and the coroner ruled his death accidental. Malcolm, however, believed that his father was murdered by a group similar to Ku Klux Klan, the Black Legion. After Al's death, Malcolm's mother Louise became overwhelmed by family responsibilities and entered a downward spiral of mental collapse. This led to her being institutionalized in 1939, and her 8 children were scattered. Exactly 3 days after Malcolm's murder, his friend and close ally, Pio Gama Pinto, was also taken out. On that Wednesday morning, Pinto drove his wife Emma to her workplace and then returned home for a quick breakfast and to play with his 3 daughters. For some reason, he decided to take 18-month-old Tereshka on a short car ride to the gate. As the gate was opened, assassins showed up and riddled him with bullets in close range. Luckily, the baby was in the back seat and was not hit by any bullet and survived. A major manhunt was launched to identify the killers. In the end, they charged 22-year-old Kisilu Mutua with the crime and he was sentenced to death. This was later commuted and he ended up serving 35 years in prison before President Moi pardoned him in 2001. After his release, Kisilu then sued the Attorney General at the time. He stated that on 24th February 1965, he was arrested by 6 people while drinking at the New Ruathia bar with friends. He was interrogated and severely tortured by European and African police officers who wanted him to confess to murdering Pinto, and was forced to sign a statement in that regard. In 2017, a court awarded Mutua 2 million Kenyan shillings, and the judge clarified that this was for the torture Kisilu went through at the hands of the police officers, but not the trial and its conviction. Today, we still live in the system that leaders back in the day tried to challenge. Inequality, racial injustice, neocolonial control, and elite betrayal are not relics of the past. We still live them.